In other words, recognizing the difference between the being and the becoming of an organic system is at the core of a dialectical perspective. As Hegel put it, the new world, quote, the new world is perfectly realized as little as the newborn child. It realizes its potential when those previous shapes and forms are developed anew again, but developed and shaped within this new medium and with the new meaning that they have thereby acquired. Now, Marx understood this as the process of becoming. And how does that develop? The process of becoming, he said in the Grundrisse, forms a moment of the process of its development. And how does the development occur? Quote, its development to its totality consists precisely in subordinating all elements of society to itself, or in creating out of it the organs it still lacks. This is historically how it becomes a totality. So I'm going to come back to this point, but I want to reinforce it, which is the new society emerges by subordinating all the defects, all the elements it inherits. So this brings us to the first reject, the first proposition in the received doctrine that must be rejected. Reading Marx's distinction between the new society as it initially emerges and that society, once it produces its own premises, once it produces its own foundations, Lenin, in State and Revolution, interpreted this difference as two separate stages, socialism and communism. This was, but the question is, was this conception of two stages, which Lenin referred to there as stages of economic rightness, was this conception of two stages consistent with Marx's view? In Marx's critique of the Gotha program, he did indeed distinguish between a communist society as it developed on its own foundations, and one just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually stamped with the birthmarks of the old society. Further, Marx explicitly recognized that it was inevitable that the new society, when it has just emerged after extended, prolonged birth pangs, would be characterized by defects. Defects such as the orientation toward an exchange of equivalents, where the same amount of labor which he has given to society in one form, the worker receives back in another form. But this conception of two separate stages distorts. Slower or? Okay. Yeah, okay, sorry. My students always went crazy. This conception of two separate stages distorts Marx's perspective. How was what Marx said in the critique of the Gotha program any different from his general description of a single organic system which initially develops on the basis of inherited historic premises, and that further development involves it needing to transform those premises into ones that it produces itself? As capitalism did in its process of becoming, socialism must go beyond what it inherits to create its own premises. It has to generate premises in their socialist economic form. And once socialism does produce its own premises, then we can say socialism is now developed on its own foundations. And this process of development is a process of becoming the organic system of socialism. Quote, its development to a totality consists precisely in subordinating all elements of society to itself, or in creating out of it the organs it still lacks. This is historically how it becomes a totality. I argue in the book Socialist Alternative, we will never understand Marx's conception of socialism or what he had to say about economic systems in general if we don't grasp the essential distinction between the becoming of a system and the being of a system, between the historical emergence of a particular form of society and the nature of that society once it develops on its own premises, its own foundations. So, should we accept the idea that Marx abandoned his dialectical perspective and substituted it for that a concept of discrete stages with separate, different principles? In fact, there's no basis basis for that substitution. But does it matter? Does it matter, make a difference whether we look upon this as a single organic system in the process of becoming, or whether we look upon it as two separate stages? Well, yes, it does. Because the concept of separate stages is only the first step in Lenin's interpretation, which became the received doctrine for all 20th century attempts to build socialism. That separation to two stages creates the theoretical space for alien concepts. It creates the theoretical space for a concept of a distinct socialist principle, distribution in accordance with contribution, and for the place assigned to the development of productive forces in the transition from the lower to the higher stage. So let's consider the second reject, the last one, the question of productive forces. Recall that the central question that Lenin was concerned with and asking in State and Revolution was the character of the state after capitalism. His answer was that it varied. A state would be unnecessary in the higher stage of communism. However, a state would clearly be required within socialism. Why? And Lenin said, because until such time as you could distribute products in accordance with needs, and until such time as it was possible to allow people to choose whatever activity they wanted to engage in, a state was necessary. And what would determine that time when it was possible to go beyond that? The state would be needed, he said, to regulate, quote, the quantity of products to be received by each, and this would continue until the socialist stage brought about, quote, an enormous development of productive forces, end of quote. And that enormous development of productive forces would be, quote, the economic basis for the complete withering away of the state, close quote, and the development of communism. Distribution in accordance with needs, Lenin said, would be possible for people only, quote, when their labor becomes so productive that they will voluntarily work according to their ability, close quote. Everything would depend on the development of productive forces. Everything to move you to the higher stage of economic ripeness would require only that development of productive forces. And no question is posed there about the nature of those productive forces. No question is posed there about the organic link between the character of relations of production and the productive forces developed within them. But that ignores everything Marx had to say about the development of productive forces under capitalism in Volume 1 of Capital. The productive forces that developed under capitalism flow from and reflect the particular set of relations of production characteristic of capitalism. After all, the specifically capitalist mode of production was developed as capital proceeded to subordinate all elements of society to itself and to create the organs it still lacked. That was what he called the historical reshaping of the traditional inherited means of labor into a form adequate to capital. That's from the Grundrisse. And those new productive forces we've seen were not neutral. Peculiar to and characteristic of the productive forces that capital developed, we see, were that they distort the worker into a fragment of a man. This is the quote from Capital. They degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine. They destroy the content of his labor by turning it into a torment. They alienate from him the intellectual potentialities of the labor process. They deform the process, they deform the conditions under which he works. All quotes from Capital. Indeed, within the capitalist system, Marx concluded, quote, all methods for raising the social productivity of labor are put into effect at the cost of the individual worker, close quote.